Hello, my name is Mark Gibson, and you're listening to the podcast version of the Teagasc Signpost Series, a weekly webinar that promotes and examines sustainability in Irish farming.
Good morning, and you're very welcome on this bright sunny morning to our Signpost webinar. The Signpost webinar is brought to you in association with Food Drink Ireland SkillNet, Dairy Sustainability Ireland, and the National Rural Network. This morning I'm joined by co-host Tom O'Dwyer. Tom, you're very welcome.
Thanks, Pat.
And this morning we're delighted to have Dr. Andrew Cromie. Andrew is Technical Director with ICBF and has been working on breeding indices with Teagasc and with ICBF for, I suppose, about 20 years now, Andrew, and has been one of the leading figures behind what I think has been one of the great successes of Irish agriculture, has been in the development of those breeding indices and the impact that they've had on Irish agriculture. Andrew, you're really welcome.
Thank you very much, Pat.
Andrew, you might just give us a little bit of background to the work you've been doing with ICBF over those years and where it's...
Thanks, Pat. No, I'm sure I'm with ICBF from the start, which is it's almost 25 years now. It's over 20 years I'm in Cork. So, but obviously from the early days of just pulling the data together into the central database, I suppose, the big projects in the early days was really the EBA was the seminal project, the key project. We know the background there, the challenges we were facing, and there was a lot of really good research then done in Moore Park, still is obviously now, but then working with the advisory service and the extension, really getting that whole EBA message out through to farms. And they were challenging times, but also very, very exciting times. And as you said there, Pat, at the start, absolutely no doubt that it is simply delivered for dairy farmers. And look, we're just now we're delivering the same principles on beef, and now we're into the challenging one of dairy beef and promoting dairy beef integration. I'll touch on that later on. And of course, one of the big challenges we have now is the whole area of greenhouse gases and how we integrate those into our indexes. But as you can see from my title slide, I'm looking upon these as opportunities, so all very positive still.
Yeah, and I suppose the history of all the indices is that they are moving targets. The things that we're aiming at all the time have moved right since the beginning.
And that causes frustration because farmers we live in a world where we like exactness, our responsibility is to make sure that farmers are well aligned for what's coming in the future, and that'll cause some temporal changes to the bulls we picked last year, and now they've changed a bit and causes a bit of frustration, etc. But I think our track record is one of delivery now in this space now. So.
And second to none. Okay, listen, without further ado, if you want to, you've shared your screen. If you want to just go into presentation mode and take it away. Thanks again.
Okay, thanks. And look, delighted to be on the Signpost Farm series, to have the opportunity to talk with the group. Look, as I alluded to there, Pat, I really looking at the role of breeding and addressing these greenhouse gas mitigation opportunities, and I'm very much focused on opportunities. So in terms of what we're going to cover over the course of the next 25 minutes, half an hour, is, it's obviously just looking back in terms of what are the current indexes delivered, but then really to look at some of the new opportunities for the future. And we're going to spend a bit of time talking about carbon sub-indexes, so people are well aware of, the fertility sub-index or the beef sub-index or whatever. So new sub-indexes around carbon traits. Then this is the one that's probably getting most attention, or a lot of attention at the moment, the opportunity to select directly for methane traits, that you could actually have animals that, emit less methane. We're going to talk about some of the data we have now on that. A lot of interest at the moment around earlier finishing age. Can we actually breed for animals that'll finish younger? And of course, the answer to that is yes. And then I'm going to touch on two broader initiatives. One around carbon farming models, which is work again we're doing with Teagasc and Board BIA. And then I'm going to talk about, a bigger project in many ways, which we're presenting very much as a cross-cutting initiative, which has the potential to benefit everyone, which is genotyping the national cattle herd, and within that there's a positive aspect we need to pick up around dairy beef integration, and then maybe just to finish off on some of the key decisions for dairy and beef farmers this spring. So maybe just looking back, you know, Pat, and you were alluding to the early days of the EBA. Yeah, this is where we came from. You know, high indexed Holstein animals, not the answer. You know, they had lots of milk solids, but really, really disappointing female fertility. This has gone back to the early 2000s. You know, lots of people in the seminar remember these days, the frustrations it caused, etc. But it was then based on solid science, and I would have to say, you know, that's the way ICBF have worked. It's based on understanding the problem, working in closely with Teagasc and others to understand the science behind addressing the problem. So, you know, lots of really excellent research work in Teagasc over many years, including the early Curtains farm work, and then being able to then deliver in terms of the change that was required, and then the sustained improvements in profitability that we see as a consequence. So, you know, these are the heifers that were calving back in the early 2000s. And the orange line here is the rate of gain in EBA. It's increasing by about 10 euros per year. In overall terms, it's been worth, you know, 4 or 5 cents per litre for dairy farmers between the heifers they're calving in this year relative to the same heifers they calved in 15 years ago. So, you know, as a consequence, people have great confidence and faith in EBA as a simply a tool or that's delivering on farm year in year, and it's driven off, you know, these, you know, when we look at and this is an analysis looking at the high EBA herds versus average versus low EBA herds and the sort of performance that's being achieved in those herds, and of course the one that we're also interested in now is, and this is linking through with the Board BA carbon footprint data, you can see that these high EBA herds also have a lower carbon footprint, 1.04 kilograms of CO2e per kilogram of fat and protein compared for the low EBA herds compared to 0.9. So certainly confirming that the high EBA herds are more carbon efficient. And whenever we do the sums on this, and this is, you know, what's there in the Teagasc MAC curve, you know, that's the sort of mitigation potential. So when we talk about a 4.5 to 6.5 million tonne target for the industry, EBA trends, those current EBA trends could deliver about 650 kilotons. And it's the same principle for beef, you know, the frustration and anger felt by beef farmers whenever all of a sudden there was a new science-based metric brought into the beef data and genomics program. We're back in 2014. You know, a lot of angry farmers in Claremorris. I mean, was it just, were their concerns justified? Yes, they were, because probably at that stage the whole area of genetics and genomics in beef was still quite new. But I suppose again it was based on the knowledge that was really solid science here, that we were confident that by starting to move farmers towards these higher genetic merit animals, particularly for the maternal traits, which was where we were having the problem, that we would ultimately result in animals that were going to be more profitable and more carbon efficient for beef farmers. And look, that has shown itself as well. The genetic trends, which were going in the wrong direction for milk and fertility in our suckler beef herd, have now completely turned around. And it's also clear that the higher genetic merit, as in replacement index, further replacement index, those higher genetic merit herds in beef also have I just put the pointer on there, also have the lower carbon footprint. So you can see these high replacement index beef herds, you know, they have a lighter cow, 650 compared to 690, a heavier calf, more efficient, better fertility, a lower carbon footprint. And when we do the sums on that index, you know, we can see the potential to mitigate 181 kilotons of that national target. So what does this mean in overall terms? You know, and I appreciate there's quite a few numbers here, but I'm just really going to zone in on where we are currently versus where we need to go to. And this is one of the challenges that I know in communicating the benefits of breeding has been difficult. because the way breeding has got presented in the context of the MAC, the Teagasc MAC curve, the MAC curve works on the basis of, for these efficiency measures, having a cap on output. That's the way it can best capture the efficiency gains. Now that assumes then that you're able to, by capping output and by having more productive animals with a lower carbon footprint, effectively you can keep fewer animals. So you're fixing output and keeping fewer animals. And that's as a result of that, you get this 658 kiloton reduction in CO2e from selection on EBA and 181 from selection on the replacement index. It's really by virtue of largely being able to keep fewer animals. But that hasn't been the case. We haven't fixed output, as you know, in our agri industry. I mean, we've continued to grow our output, and that's a positive for all of the reasons we can identify on. And we've largely, there's been a lot of talk about a stable herd. So, and we have largely approached a stable herd across dairy and beef. And in that scenario, you can see that the current EBA trends really don't mitigate a lot. And that's simply because, if we keep the cow numbers constant, well, we're generating more output, as in kilograms of carcass weight or fat and protein kilogram or fat and protein. And that additional gain in output needs more feed and fertilizer. So from a, we'll call it an overall perspective, we're getting very little net gain in our CO2e. So as a result of that, we're then having to move from what we call these enabling measures that enable efficiency gains, to actually looking at measures that will result in a direct reduction in CO2e. So we're actually starting to move towards, for example, breeding for animals that will have a lower methane, at the animal level. So that's where our focus has moved to. And I'm going to cover that over the course of the next number of slides, these direct measures. But when we do that, and we've done this work with Teagasc and an outside consultant we've worked closely with down for many years, Abacus Bio, we can still see that we can mitigate 1 million tons off the 4.5 to 6.5 million ton target, but it will require us to zone in on, new traits, new areas, new opportunities. So there will be a level of change coming, but it's with the confidence that, that we can certainly look to work towards and help to mitigate CO2e across our agri-food industry. So taking the first one as an example, and the work that we're currently doing with Teagasc around a new carbon subindex. So people are familiar on the call with the EBA, and you have a milk subindex, a fertility subindex. You have, the maintenance part, the beef part, etc. And this just gives you a sense of what's currently happening with the EBA. So yes, we are reducing down emissions by selecting more on higher EBA animals. On average, do have a lower carbon emissions per lactation. Okay, and that's a positive. So that's consistent with what we were showing earlier on, that it's still reducing down, but not as much as if we had a cap on output. And that's the sort of order of reduction that you can see in terms of the reduction in CO2e that we're currently getting in the EBA. I suppose what we are looking at doing is putting more weighting on the sort of carbon traits within the existing EBA. And you might say, well, what are the carbon traits that are there within the existing EBA? And it's really the female fertility traits. So by putting more weighting on the female fertility traits within the current EBA, effectively what you're able to do is be in a position to, for example, carry fewer replacements. That's a good example of, and as a consequence, we need fewer dairy replacement stock on our inventory. And there are benefits of that associated then with having a lower overall output in terms of greenhouse gases. So that's one example of, by putting more weighting on the female fertility traits, we can certainly accelerate the gain or accelerate that reduction in CO2. And it's by the order of doubling that rate again from sort of the current 0.3% per year to about 0.6% per year. Now, that will cause some level of re-ranking. It will also take us away from our optimum around profitability. We're saying that potentially there's if you were to compare that with an index that's focused purely on profit, you're looking at a 15% reduction. But that's in the expectation that carbon in itself is going to be a trait of economic value in the future. So certainly confident that that's something that's going to be able to take us in the right direction. So the second area that we're working closely on is the whole area of breeding for lower methane animals. And again, this is work that we're doing in our performance test station in Tully in County Kildare, where we're actually bringing animals in. These are all progeny of AI sires that are involved in the Gene Ireland breeding program. Important to appreciate, it's just not beef animals, it's beef, it's dairy animals, steers, heifers that we're bringing in. And then we're measuring their feed growth, feed intake and efficiency, and also crucially, their methane output per day, grams per day, and obviously working closely with Teagasc and others in the analysis and interpretation of this data. So what are we seeing? On average, animals will emit during their finishing period about 250 grams per day. But there's also very clear evidence of differences between these animals, between systems, between breeds in terms of their level of methane emissions. And whenever we start to look at this, and this is an initial analysis looking at some test EBVs for dairy AI sires whose progeny have gone through Tully. So each of these dots are based on progeny from AI sires, their steer progeny that have now gone through Tully. Okay. So, we have 200 or 300 dairy steers that have also gone through Tully at this stage. So here we're looking at the average methane output grams per day of those steers, and based on generating genetic evaluations for the whole data set, but then crucially looking at what sort of variation are we seeing here for these different groups of AI sires. And this is the EBI of those AI sires, so bulls, and this is these are the animals that have been in the breeding program over the course, Gene Ireland breeding program over the course of the last, 5-8 years. And yet you can see sires in there with EBIs 200, 250, 300, but also crucially, we're seeing sires that have really nice variation here in their grams of methane per day. And it's obviously these sires down at the bottom that we're really interested in. Can we have high EBI, but also with a 10% lower methane grams per day? And I mean, that's where the real opportunity is. If we can start to have these high EBI animals that have good milk solids and good fertility, it's these sires down here that we really want to be using in the future in the breeding program, because they then give us confidence that we're going to be able to reduce down our methane per day in the animals that are going to be coming through each year, each generation, and for the next 10, 15, 20, 25, 30 years into the future. So it's very, very positive initial results. Certainly at this stage, we are looking at potentially generating these and applying through into our beef indexes, because this data is based largely then on a finishing diet. So looking at potentially bringing this into our beef indexes there in 2022, 2023. Question has been raised, well, what about dairy? And it's still, it's too early in dairy. Obviously we're looking at animals on an indoor finishing diet. Big questions there around, well, how does this relate to a dairy cow relative to an animal on a finishing diet? It might be a dairy steer on a finishing diet, but also how does it relate to a grass-based diet versus, for example, an indoor diet? So these are big research questions, and we're involved now with Teagasc and others in a number of big research projects to really up our ambition around how we collect more methane data, including on dairy cows and on grass, to be able to generate genomic predictions for methane traits for our dairy beef and beef herd. And ultimately the plan is to have those good genomic predictions that we can genotype young animals and apply then into the breeding program and be able to identify these animals with this real methane mitigation potential in the future. I'm going to talk a wee bit about age at slaughter now, because that's a trait that there's a lot of discussion and interest in. what perhaps people haven't appreciated, that we have been making really steady progress on reducing down age at slaughter, about 45 days since 2010, including, very significant reductions in the last 12 months, especially. And that's probably a small bit of a hangover from, COVID and factory blockades late 2019. All of these had ripple effects through in terms of throughput, but certainly there's a momentum now building around an earlier finish in aging. And if you look at, for example, suckler bred steers going back over 10 years, you can see consistently, if we go back to 2012, 2015, 2018, now 2020, 2022, 21, 20, and now 2022, you can really see, we've been making consistent reductions in age at slaughter, and that's continuing through into the 22 year to date. So very positive gains there. And I suppose the question is being raised, well, can we actually go faster to help achieve these greenhouse gas targets? And the simple answer to that is yes, but we do need to move towards science-based approaches to being able to quantify the gross emissions that an animal is generating during its lifetime. And if you think about how we might do that, well, there was some really nice work presented there by Paul Crossan at the Teagasc Beef Conference there in November, where he highlighted the point that it's just not about age at slaughter. And the point that he was drawing out there was whenever Teagasc and Grange and compared two groups of animals, one group of animals that were slaughtered at 28 months on a grass-only diet compared to another group of animals that were slaughtered 4 months earlier, but with a grass and concentrates diet. Well, actually, you see the gross emissions here, CO2e, for both groups of animals was about 4 tons per animal. So even though these animals were 4 months earlier in terms of age at slaughter, the additional cost of the concentrates, feed and fertilizer, etc., resulted in the same gross emissions. So there's a really important point here about having science-based metrics and understanding the systems that animals are in to really maximize the opportunities around reducing or promoting an earlier finish in age. And that's where we've been working with Teagasc and Abacus Bio again to develop out this animal carbon footprint or gross emissions for every animal in the database. And we have now applied that for animals that have been slaughtered over the course of the last 5 years. And this is just looking at data from 2021, the prime cattle kill of 1.3 million animals. And it's really interesting to look at, if you even take, for example, these steers here, 663,000 steers. About 10% of steers are really slaughtered in no system as such. They go through multiple movements and they end up in the factory, slaughtered at 335 months and 380 kilos. But look, they're generating 6.7 tons of emissions, CO2e, in their lifetime. And if we compare that with, for example, a very efficient system, which is steers slaughtered off grass in the second summer, at this end of the second summer, there's a difference there of 3 tons, over 3 tons, 3.7 tons in terms of gross emissions. So these were the real opportunities are to help to promote an earlier finish in age, because if we can do that, well, then we can certainly mitigate off additional greenhouse gases from our national inventory. And we've done a nice bit of work again with Teagasc to understand what are the potential opportunities here. And it is really about understanding these systems and being able to, for example, address these animals that are in no system as such, and at least get them into finishing off grass in the third summer or finished out of the house in that second winter. Or alternatively, looking at ways to promote or encourage farmers to, instead of finishing off grass in the third summer, can we finish animals off grass in the second summer? Or even those opportunities around 1 month gains within your system through better technical efficiency. And if you do that sort of exercise for steers, and over a period of time, there's the opportunity to mitigate off 400 kilotons, so again off that 4.5 million to 6.5 million ton target. And whenever we apply in both the heifers and the young bulls into that, well, there's certainly 800 kilotons then that can be mitigated off. And again, there's an important point in all of that, these are repeatable. So every time you move another 100,000 animals, say, for example, into that finished off grass in the second summer, or as you get another month again on the technical efficiency, that 800 can become a million, could become 1.2 million, again, off that 4.5 million ton target. And, there's an important point that the momentum is here on this one. The trends are positive. So now what we're looking at are really the enabling factors that'll help to drive this faster. And these are just some of the factors we're working with Teagasc and others to bring forward, working closely with Dunnaberry and his team around new genetic evaluations for an earlier finishing age. So in addition to the growth traits that are taking us in the right direction, could we actually go faster by additionally selecting on and promoting earlier finish? And of course, the answer to that is yes. We've rolled out a new commercial beef value. DNA calf registration is something that has real potential. I'll touch on that towards the end. As a sex semen, some of the people on the call might have picked up on the new beef benchmarking reports, which we're currently piloting with ADP around these gross emissions at the animal level. And they are now available for all animals in the database. And our goal is to roll those across out to all beef farmers through the meat processors over the course of the next 6, 9, 12 months. And of course, there are various industry initiatives that are happening at the moment, whether they're Department of Agriculture, EU, RDP type programs, or engagement in industry initiatives. So there's lots of momentum building around earlier finishing age, and it's certainly one that we believe has a lot of potential. Another one, which just to draw attention to, is the whole area of carbon farming. In the past, we've been very, very focused on carbon footprinting. And obviously, we've been working closely over the course of the last, particularly over the course of the last 6, 9 months with both Bord Bia and with Teagasc. So again, unknowns to many, ICBF in the database, and instead of us providing the data to Bord Bia and them crunching the numbers based on the Teagasc carbon footprint model, we now do the back end work from an ICBF standpoint. And it makes more sense. It's a better fit. It's a better service in terms of support. And it's a good example of the stakeholders working closely to provide these carbon footprint data through to farmers now. So we did that successfully in dairy in October time. We're now in the process of repeating it for beef, with the goal of having that available during the summertime. So that's the way it's working now. I suppose in terms of how we see this moving more and more in the future, it's about automating those data feeds around feed and fertilizer. There's new, as you know, talk of fertilizer registers. The importance of having strong validated data now flowing into these carbon footprints is going to be absolutely crucial. And the other thing that's going to be crucial, we will continue to talk about carbon footprinting, but more importantly, we have to start to talk about gross emissions at the farm level. So that's the total emissions. And if we can do that, because carbon footprinting, remember, assumes that we're really, capping output. Go back to the very discussion we had at the start. No, we now need to talk about total emissions and get farmers understanding the total emissions that are on their farm. So if it's 1 million tons, he's finding ways of, well, how can I get it down to 900 or 800? And then it's not a discussion about simply reducing down cows. It's a discussion about the measures, for example, that are in the MAC that are going to give me an extra 50. There's another 80 there. There's another 20 if I do that. So that's the discussion. So there'll be a big push now towards moving the whole conversation towards understanding and appreciating the gross emissions, because that's what the inventory calculates or looks at. It's gross emissions. That's what we have to reduce. 4.5 million to 6.5 million tons. So we need our farmers and our industry talking in the same language. We're going to finish off by talking about just one last, we call it the cross-cutting measure, which is genotyping out the national cattle herd. Look, and there are so many benefits to this, simply in terms of our opportunity to increase genetic gain. And we know that by having more animals genotyped, by tidying up the parentage errors, by having more accurate data, it simply helps us to identify better the outliers for the breeding program. And as a consequence of that, we can accelerate our gain above what we're currently doing by on the order of 20%. The other big benefit that we can see straight away is once you have your herd genotype, whether it's a dairy herd or a beef herd, as you come in with these carbon subindexes, these direct measurements of methane, you immediately get a very good picture of where this herd is at from a greenhouse gas perspective. And you do that with 100% surety around the ancestry. There, as we all know, there is no messing with the DNA, there's no vagueness, that's it. And you know exactly where this herd is at. So any future carbon farming or carbon auditing, will certainly benefit hugely from having a really accurate picture of where the herd is at. And then, of course, there's lots of other benefits in terms of, dairy, in terms of genotyping, whether it's helping to promote greater dairy beef integration, enhanced traceability. We led, I suppose, the discussions around traceability in the past through our identification and registration systems. But look, others have caught up on that. But can we now introduce genotyping as a way to really talk about enhanced traceability? There's lots of other benefits around labour saving, R&D, a market point of difference, very hard to others to mimic what we might be able to do in this space in terms of from our dairy and beef processing perspective. So look, there's a very positive and active discussion around transitioning our national cattle herd to being DNA-based calf registration. And look, there's real wins for government and in industry in that regard. And there's good discussions then in terms of what it might cost and how we might share those costs, etc. And these are then just one example. I wanted to pick up the dairy beef integration one because I know in the audience today, we have obviously people coming from a dairy background and a beef background as well as others. And I mean, two of the big challenges on dairy beef integration is for the rearer knowing what he's getting. And that's one of the big, I suppose, issues that impacts confidence amongst calf rearers. The surety of what he's buying, that when he buys that calf in the ring or off a farmer, that he'd like more surety as to what he's getting. And obviously the genotyping and the genetic mirror linked to that at birth will help provide that. And of course, the second one then is the question the dairy farmers are asking, well, can we have both? Can we have easy calving and with a good calf? And of course, the answer to that is yes. And genotyping will help us identify those outliers for the breeding program so that we can identify beef bulls that will be easy calving and short gestation, but with a decent calf. And the other one that dairy farmers perhaps aren't even thinking about really at this stage, but it comes up all the time in conversation. It's this trade-off then between, they want a light cow, but they also understand that they can't have too light a calf. You need enough of the growth traits in there to get a decent calf. And whether that's on a dairy meal calf or the dairy beef calf. But again, genotyping is such an important way to help us to identify those sort of outlier animals for the breeding program that break the correlation between, we'll call it, that cow size and the size of her calf, So that's where the real opportunities are. And to finish, look, I know it always comes up, well, what do I need to do this spring? This is well-versed, few points. Understand who you are, understand what you want to breed, get your team of AI bulls and breed from your best cows. That's what's there currently, whether it's dairy or beef. I suppose if I was to talk about what's going to be there maybe next spring, and I say spring 2023, we're going to be working towards that new carbon subindex in beef in the EBA. That opportunity around new methane traits for the beef indexes based on Tully data, and certainly an early finish subindex across all of the indexes. So there's a real momentum now starting to build around greenhouse mitigation opportunities, across our dairy and beef herd. So to summarize, Tom, Chairman, genetics is delivering, in terms of profitability, sustainability, climate and environment. As I said it earlier, the goalposts have shifted, but even after shifting the goalposts more towards these mitigation traits now, we're very confident that ICBF breeding, the industry, we can deliver off a million tons of mitigation of that 4.5 to 6.5 million ton target. And we're also very confident that by working closely with all stakeholders, there's certainly another 1 million tonnes there available around earlier fish finishing. And I would also suggest that, we're going to more and more be talking about gross emissions. That's going to become the new carbon metric at farm level. And we'll obviously continue to be working very closely with Teagasc, Bord Bia and others to deliver that out. And the last one is that one around genotyping. It's a cross-cutting measure that has the potential to deliver for all stakeholders in many, many areas, but also including, crucially, that greenhouse gas mitigation. So thank you very much, Tom, and happy to take any questions.
Okay, Andrew, if you just stop sharing your, that's great. Listen, anybody who might have thought that you were resting on your laurels of success in previous indices and don't have much to do, I think there's an indication that a hell of a lot going on and a hell of a lot more work to do in the area. And really, thank you very much for a really illuminating presentation there. I suppose just one question, first of all, and just remind people to put their questions in the Q&A. There's a good few questions coming in there. But in terms of our ability to incorporate the gains that we have the potential to make here in the national inventories and to get them counted as gains, so that we stop using the standards and the defaults. I presume the type of science and the type of data you are generating will enable that to happen.
Yeah, and look, we're in good discussions with Teagasc and the EPA around the national inventory models and how can we actually make sure if we're starting to generate genetic gain, for example, in these methane mitigation traits, how can that actually be reflected then through into the inventory? I mean, what's crucial there is, one, it has to be solid science, peer-reviewed, validated and repeatable, including, being able to back calculate. And we're in a very, very fortunate position with data and databases and genetics to be able to do that, because really what you're talking about there is once you can demonstrate that you're making an improvement in something, well then effectively what you're doing, Chairman, is updating those emission factors then on an annual basis. So if you're making improvements in the emission factors, which you can demonstrate through your validation, well, then that's capturing, that gets updated then in the national inventory model on an annual basis. And you're able to capture the benefits of the lower emitting animals then in that way, and it's the same for the other traits. So that's the approach we would take, and certainly we're having good discussions with Teagasc and the EPA and the department in that regard. But very confident that they will be realised. It's a legitimate concern that people raise, but that's how they'd be realised, John.
Tom, a lot of questions coming in.
Yeah, for sure, Pat. And again, echo your comments to remind our participants this morning, if they want to ask a question, to put it up on the Q&A tab. Andrew, the first thing, just maybe an observation from myself. I think it's really, really great and significant that you're talking about gross emissions. And I suppose my question related to that, how soon do you think that ICBF might be in a position to present a gross emissions figure as you've described to individual dairy and beef farmers?
Yeah, so first of all, it's there. It's just, it's not the metric we've talked about, Yeah. So the Teagasc carbon footprint model, which we're now running, doing the sums for, which Bord Bia are reporting, the gross emissions is there. It's just not being reported because it was almost like people had a fear of talking about gross emissions. It was easier to talk about carbon footprint because it was aligned with the MAC. It was aligned where we were at as an industry. But the discussion now has moved on, as we all know. It's about total emissions. So we have to now get farmers and the industry talking about total emissions. And that's one of the benefits we've seen of, even the bit of work that we've done with the meat processing industry around those gross emissions at the animal level. All of a sudden, farmers understand that, it's quite simple. If I can bring from a finished off grass in the third summer to finished off grass in the second summer, that's 2 tons of emissions. Oh, right, okay. If I do that across 1 million animals, That's 2 million tons. And it's about presenting this stuff in language that farmers understand, so that whenever we start to promote and talk about, why we need to move your herd from 1 million down to, so Tom, it's really crucial when we start to move towards gross emissions.
Excellent. Okay, and a question then from Michael. He highlights, or he comments on the fact that you highlight in your presentation that in breeding there's going to be trade-offs. And he highlights the trade-off between perhaps fertility and maintenance versus beef merit. And I think you referred to it yourself in your presentation. And he wonders in his question whether perhaps in that trade-off, whether to date we've maybe erred a little bit too much on the side of fertility and maintenance and have lost some of the beefing merit as a result. That's his question. So would you like to
it's a fair point, and and look, that has been one of the challenges in, as we focused really around that dairy efficiency piece, which is driven off a smaller cow live weight, etc. The casualty in that regard is obviously the calf. So there is a bit of rebalancing there required, but then again, in doing the rebalancing, we also do have to appreciate that we do want a smaller cow. From a carbon perspective, they do emit less methane. But we do want to make sure that when getting the smaller cow, we also have a decent calf, because that's crucial for the dairy beef integration piece. And I suppose, Tom, that's where, we can be quite crude, and maybe we've been quite crude about these sort of differences and trying to get that trade-off in the past. But that's where genotyping, and as I said, trying to identify these outliers for the breeding program becomes crucial. Because I remember, and you'll remember, in the early days of the EBI, people didn't think you could get high yield and good fertility. If you had high yield, you had fertility problems. That was the discussion. But of course, the breeding program and genotyping helped us to break the correlation, to find the outliers. And that's exactly what we now need to do in this trade-off between cow size and the calf. And genotyping will be key to that.
And continuing then on the fertility one, Andrew, and you've said yourself in your presentation that there will be an increased focus on the fertility subindex. Is there a point at which it's not possible to produce improve fertility further? You get the 90% cows calved in 6 weeks. You have the less than 10% empty rate. How much further can you improve it?
Yeah, so look, we're not there as an industry at this stage, Tom, as you well know. Like our 6 week calving rate is still what's the 67, 68%. So we've still gains to be made on the female fertility piece. It is about compactness of calving and also being able to carry less replacements. But at a point in time, you hit to a certain extent, the incremental gains from that trait reduce. But certainly in the short term, we'd see more weighting going in on the female fertility. In the medium to longer term, Tom, that'll get replaced by then the direct selection for methane. So we've got the fertile cow and she's actually producing less methane.
Okay.
Or we have the animal that's able to finish earlier, because it's another good example of a biological, there's a point where you don't want to go any younger.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. Because you need carcass growth. You need to get them to a minimum carcass weight. But when you start to approach that limit, it's all about then the direct measurement, also then the animals that have lower methane. And that's there's two steps to this whole process in many ways, Tom. It's first looking at the carbon traits, but then following quickly then with the direct measurement of methane traits.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. So another question that features in the Q&A is in relation to the genomic testing, which you highlighted as an enabling technology. And I suppose you and ICBF have been talking about this for a few years now, Andrew. It's not today or yesterday the talk of genomically testing the national herd has commenced. The question that I note in the chat is around the cost. What's that technology likely to cost farmers? Who's going to meet that cost? And there's kind of a third part of the question in relation to if that cost is to be borne, say, by the dairy farmer or the animal breeders, maybe. you know, and the benefit is to the industry, you know, so the person who's finishing the animal or the beef processor or the overall industry benefits, is that fair that the cost is carried by the person who carries out the test, I think is what's meant by the question. So,
yeah, look, and I'll answer the question, maybe even the third part first, because that wouldn't be fair. You know, there are multiple beneficiaries, including the state. You know, our mitigation is about, you know, what's been levied there on agriculture is the 4.5 million of a national target. So if our government, and we know there's a transition in discussion in terms of low carbon economies, this is a good example of something that is a piece of infrastructure that can really help to kickstart that. So there's certainly a state part to the discussion.
Mm-hmm.
And look, the initial feedback we've got from our Department of Agriculture has been positive in that regard. Similarly, there's a broader beef and dairy industry benefit, which they're acknowledging and seeing from again, how we present and position our product in international markets, from a carbon perspective. The enhanced traceability cannot be understated. It still is the number one issue, traceability for our processing industry. And of course, then there are the farmer benefits, you know, in terms of accelerated gain, labour saving, all of that sort of stuff. In terms of the cost, I suppose our sense of it, Tom, if we could really get momentum towards genotyping out the national cattle herd, starting, say, for example, in 2023, you know, and over a 3-year period. Well, the first thing to note is farmers are already paying, those that are in DNA calf registration, they're about €5, but they pay that for their tag and the postage in and out of the samples.
Mm.
So that then becomes a very, very strong component of the overall cost of genotyping. There's €5 contribution there for farmers. And bear in mind, you have to get the tag. You have to do the tagging anyway, you know, but now we're getting the tag and the DNA off the farm. And then our best sense of what the additional cost after that is probably, if we can do it at scale, it's in the order of €10, you know. So now we're looking at €10 to talk to the broader government, dairy, meat processing industry, for example, about how we might find some equitable shared funding model that would acknowledge the farmer's €5 contribution through his tag and his postage. And then, well, we have another €10 to find. And, you know, I accept it gets into a big figure. It's €30 million per annum, you know, 2.5 million calves or thereabouts, 25 million. But we also know that there's lots and lots of benefits. And when we do the sort of cost benefits of it, you know, there's a 3-4 to 1 return on that investment easily from a broad industry perspective.
Two other questions then. One is you mentioned 2023, so obviously discussions are ongoing. But you know, are we potentially that close to having a national genotyping for calves, do you think?
2023 would be ambitious. It would require a lot of engagement, buy-in, support. I mean, even at that, you would be looking, when I say 2023, if you were to get something going in 2023, it would be over a 3 to 4 year period. You would bring in, you know, maybe you might find yourself, you know, you bring in 5 or 10,000 herds in 2023, 28,000 herds in 2024, the same again in 2025. But by the time you'd get to 2026, you have the full 70,000 herds that are generating calves in DNA calf registration.
Okay.
Approach it.
Yeah. Andrew, so just one thing that's come in there. We're in a time of I suppose change with policy coming in. Are there policy enablers that are policy initiatives or modifications of schemes that are there that could help in propelling us forward? Are there recommendations that you might have there?
Yeah, look, it's a good, I know, Pat, it's a good question. I mean, obviously the beef data and genomics program is there, and there's a significant genotyping component to that. I suppose there's a lot of new developments coming through now at the moment around this whole, for example, earlier finishing, and there's good discussions there about how could something like that integrate into a future, EU RDP funded program, how it might link in with industry initiatives. They've already started as well with the meat processing industry. So there certainly, yes, is the simple answer to that, Pat. But again, it was, it'll need the relevant stakeholders to sit down and prioritize. And look, the Food Vision Group, for example, that are meeting at the moment, the dairy group is met, and our understanding is there's going to be a beef and sheep group, there's going to be other groups. It's those types of forums where people are going to have to make the tough decisions around, well, how are we going to approach? We have a target to hit, and what are the projects or the areas we're going to approach, and what do we expect them to deliver, and what are they going to cost? And certainly we believe this is one measure that has lots of multi-stakeholder benefit. And that's one of the reasons why it's sometimes hard to get the financial support for it. If there was one beneficiary, you can go straight to them and say, this is a simple enough investment exercise, but it's more complex than that, as you appreciate.
Yeah. Okay. The other question that's come up from two people, I think, as far as I can see, is in relation to what you're kind of projecting forward in terms of maybe changes to age at slaughter, and increased fertility, so more animals born in 6 weeks, potentially could lead to changes in the supply pattern of beef animals to the factories for processing, and could that then in turn lead to problems at the processing side, bottlenecks at certain times of the year?
Again, we've done some work on this with Teagasc and the meat processing industry. Now, I know Paul Crossan and his team are doing a lot more work on this, but the simple answer to that question is no, Tom. We might think that that's a concern or that's an issue, but the reality of it is, if we look across, first of all, we have 3 genders: young bulls, steers, and heifers. And we have effectively then, 3 key systems: finished off grass in the 3rd summer, finished off grass in the 2nd summer. Now, I accept there's a point there, but there's also that finished out of the house in 2 years of age. But as you overlay the young bulls, the genders onto those systems, you can actually still ensure a very, very consistent supply of beef. And that's the key point.
Even with your proposed future changes.
Even with the proposed future changes, absolutely.
And what role then? Another question then. What role then do factories and the processing sector have in perhaps incentivizing or encouraging beef producers to shift their
Look, they have a key role, and it's not just beef processors. I can make an argument that it's also dairy processors in the context of benefiting, the whole dairy beef integration piece. But I mean, we all know that incentivization leads to benefits in terms of beneficial moves in the right direction. We saw, for example, best example is, somatic cell count in our dairy industry, milk quality payments, they created the momentum for change. If we look at it on the beef side, the premium brand status around Angus and Herefords, they created a massive change there. So there's a new opportunity here, obviously, around earlier finish. And certainly, I think what will be crucial there is if we can help to promote that. And that's why the science-based tools become key. Because the last thing that we want, Tom, as you would well appreciate, is people chasing a bonus and incurring higher costs. They're going after the bonus, and all of a sudden, they're, let's say, wrong word, lorrying. They're pushing in more feed and fertilizer to go after a bonus, and they're no more profit. And in fact, our carbon, our gross emissions, is going the wrong way. So. Yeah. That's where these science-based tools.
And that was going to be a follow-up question of my own. I was wondering about kind of incentives creating perverse outcomes, and you've just touched on it. And I suppose, how can we prevent that happening, Andrew? Or are there ways of preventing that from happening, or reducing that, the likelihood of that happening?
I think the ways we can do it, like in terms of in the finishing systems, I think there has to be a good understanding of that. First of all, farmers need to know the finishing system they're in. They're define the system they're in, and then work within the system. You know, and if we can then promote to those farmers the technical efficiency gains that he can get within his system, or the opportunity to bring in a different type of animal into that system. And instead of, you know, the best example in that regard is, you know, the guys that are buying cattle in the sort of the store time to put them to grass to finish off grass in the third summer. What do we need to do to give those the guys the confidence to buy, you know, 8, 9, 10-month-old cattle to finish off grass in the second summer?
Okay.
There are additional technical, you know, needs there, which ultimately comes back to organizations such as yourselves and ourselves to fulfill. But every time we can do that, Tom, you know, that's 2 tons of CO2e. Every, you know, every 100,000 animals is 200 kilotons. You know, 5% of our target. Yeah.
Okay, I'll just go with one final question, Pat, anyway, from the list that's on screen in front of me at the moment. And it's just maybe to go back, Andrew, to the EBI. And you had one particular slide that looked at the scenario where the milk output was fixed. And then you had the second column then was looking at a scenario where the output was not fixed. Isn't that right?
Yeah, stable herd.
Yeah, sorry, stable herd. That's what you called it. Yeah. Yeah. So will you just go through that, just refresh that stable herd scenario and that distinction between continuing to breed and use EBI and that as an enabling factor, and then how EBI will change and bring in some direct impacts on using greenhouse gases?
So the best way to think about it is, Tom, is as we breed on the current EBA, we get increases in fat and protein. More productive cows, right? We're also getting a cow with better female fertility. So if we draw a line in the middle, you know, we're reducing cost in that regard. You know, better female fertility, lower cost in terms of feed and fertilizer, fewer replacements. But the problem that we have with the EBA currently as it's structured is that as we get the more growth and output, we need more feed and fertilizer to support the growth and output. Okay, so the gains you're getting at the bottom end in terms of having less cost of feed and fertilizer for fewer replacements, etc., are actually being lost because you've actually more output and you need feed and fertilizer to support the more output. So you're effectively at almost a net zero gain. So what we actually have to do in that scenario, there's 2 options you can have. One is you just reduce down the weighting on the output piece. Don't need as much feed and shift more onto what's in underneath the line, the female fertility piece. So fewer replacements, more compact calving, and obviously less feed and fertilizer required. And that's effectively the carbon sub-index. Okay. And then the second part of that then is the one that is the real opportunity then is obviously the direct selection for methane, because as you've rightly identified, you know, at some point in time, you've gone as far as you can with the female fertility, you know, and that's a wee bit like the age at slaughter discussion as well. So that's where the direct selection for lower methane animals becomes crucial. But really, you know, to be honest, farmers won't really start to see the benefits of that. It's going to be it's 5 years from now, you know, but they'll certainly by the time we hit 2030 and we'll start where we finished, we'll finish where we started at ICBF. You know, it's 20 years, it's 15 years, EBA 2005, you know, in 15 years time, people will look back and say, you know, geez, I can't actually believe, you know, we used to have 6 ton, you know, cows at 6 tons of CO2e, and now they've actually only 5 tons of CO2e in their lifetime. Isn't that amazing?
Yeah. So can I summarize then, just as a way of finishing my contribution, the recommendation for dairy and beef farmers, beef suckler farmers, is number 1 to be clear on the system that you're in and then optimize your performance within that system. And then secondly, in the future, you will have the opportunity to directly impact on the methane produced by your breeding animals. So you can choose to bring in lower methane producing animals into an efficient system. Yes? Yeah. Okay. So it's a two-step approach. Okay, thanks, Pat.
Okay, and thank you very much, Tom, and thank you, Andrew, for a really challenging and illuminating presentation. And it kind of puts, I suppose, a perspective on where we need to go, and asks us as many questions of the industry as it answers in some ways. In that you're giving us a technology, but we have to apply that technology to actually achieve reductions in gross emissions, not just in footprint, and that's where I think a huge element of this challenge is. Next week we will be continuing on this in this area, and we'll have Nikki Byrne from Teagasc Grange, who will be talking about the role of genetics in helping address the added value of using high merit beef sires on the dairy herd. Apologies there. So that's next Friday morning at the same time. Before I leave, I'd just like to thank our production team of Andy Boland and Yvonne Marr, who continue to put together the program and produce the program. And thanks again, Andrew and Tom.
You've been listening to the podcast version of the Teagasc Signpost Series, the weekly webinar that promotes and examines sustainability in Irish farming. Don't forget to join us live every Friday morning for our latest webinar. For more, visit teagasc.ie. And you can also rate, review, and subscribe to the Signpost Series on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts from. I'm Mark Gibson, and thanks for listening.